So, welcome to our reason for why we needed to start preparing and cooking meals. Somehow, I ended up botching one of the simplest meals that you can cook with a ready-made base for a pizza and pizza toppings straight from the fridge and popping it straight into the oven. We obviously have way too much going on at home and completely forgot about it and burnt it to a crisp. So that night we just ended up having cereal. So now begins the motivation to get some meals prepped so that we've got stuff at home, in the fridge, in the freezer, ready to go for those nights that we clearly just have too much happening and we would otherwise be eating very poorly if we didn't get organized. So, as you will probably have gathered by now, we don't really have a garden space of our own at the moment. We do have a couple of garden beds in the family garden at the property we're staying at the moment, but we haven't got any of our gardens set up at our property, and we don't really have any plants in the garden at the moment other than some pumpkins that are a bit late. We planted them a bit late, so there's probably only 2 pumpkins that might make it. Other than that, we don't really have much in the ground at the moment that is bringing us anything in. And with how life has been going in the last 6 to 12 months, we haven't really had the time to put together planning for our garden. So we have started looking towards some plans for the next 12 months, and that we will do in another video as well. But part of that is prepping some of our own meals with ingredients we're probably going to be purchasing initially, and then looking into gradually starting to plan to have our own gardens and grow our own vegetables and our own meat to be able to start preparing our own meals and preserving all year round to avoid the supermarket. So this particular weekend I decided to do some meal planning and come up with some meals that all had kind of similar background ingredients and were easy to make in bulk to be able to get some meals that freeze well and still taste really good when they're reheated. So we started with this roast chicken, and this was Saturday. We had a roast chicken for dinner with some crunchy potatoes. Our family really loves special crunchy potatoes. I'll show you in these videos how we like making them. And then just some carrots on the side. So this was just a simple meat and 2 veg dinner, but it was the base of what we would be cooking for the rest of the weekend on Sunday. So we end up using this roast chicken in the rest of the meals over the weekend. So this is the beginning of making our crunchy potatoes. We dice them up or chop them up into small cubes. Not some pieces we like to make them smaller, others I do make them a little bit larger. Ben likes to have the larger pieces that aren't as crunchy. I prefer to have the smaller pieces that are quite crunchy. So we do a bit of both. And we leave the skin on, which you might be able to see later on, but if you leave the skin on, it has a better crunch when it comes out of the oven because it does fry those skins as well. So once I've chopped them all up, I boil some water and pop them on the stove to pre-cook. So we leave them in boiling water for probably 7 to 10 minutes. I check them with a fork and just make sure that they're soft on the inside. And then get them ready for the next part of prepping those. We do really like the potatoes, so we do make quite a lot of potatoes for the one meal. I think this particular night there were 3 of us that were eating this meal, so I may have gone a little excessive on the potatoes, but they're just that good. And at this point, our chicken is now roasting. It did start out in that big big pot, but I did end up putting it into our slow cooker because I decided I needed the oven to do the rest of the meal. So I did end up cooking that in the slow cooker. I just put some butter under the skin, put some olive oil on top, and then some thyme and some rosemary to keep the flavors simple, because I was going to be using it for other meals over the weekend. So this is the second step to the crunchy potatoes. We put vegetable oil into a oven safe dish, just enough to shallow fry them. I put the oven onto about 200 to 220 degrees Celsius, and I put that pan into the oven to preheat that oil whilst the potatoes are boiling on the stove. So that pan goes into the oven without the potatoes so that the oil can come up to temperature. And then we pop those potatoes in it when it is up to temperature. So once we have drained the potatoes, I then either leave them to dry out a bit and cool down on the stovetop, or I put them in the fridge depending on when we're cooking. But on this day, they went straight into the oven, into that oil. And now I'm just prepping the pumpkin and the carrots. The pumpkin that we end up chopping up and roasting for this roast dinner, the leftover pumpkin ends up being used as part of the flavor profile for the risotto that is made as one of our bulk meals on Sunday. So that is another time saver for making the risotto. The carrots that are left over from the roasting as well that don't get eaten do get put into the chicken broth that I make on Sunday as well. So all of these veggies and the meat that are part of this roast meal are being used in other meals the next day, except for the potatoes. The potatoes, they're only really good fresh. You could probably try and refry them, but that's not something I've ever done, and they don't normally last very long anyway. So all I'm doing is topping and tailing these carrots, and then chopping them into smaller sticks, and then popping them onto a roasting tray with some olive oil into the oven at about 180 degrees Celsius. And I add that pumpkin to the same tray and just check on it regularly. I think it took something like 15 to 25 minutes. The carrots were done a bit sooner than the pumpkin, and we do vary in how we like our carrots and our pumpkin cooked as well. I personally like them a bit more cooked, almost on the caramelized side, whereas the rest of my family like them a bit less cooked. So I did pull some of those out early, and I left some of them in the oven for a little bit longer. So our goal for cooking this meal again next time would be that, or maybe not the next time, maybe next season, would be that we use our own homegrown pumpkins and our own homegrown carrots to be able to make this, and potatoes. So that is like one of our goals for towards the end of the year and the start of next year, is that the majority of the meals that we are cooking from scratch at home are made at least with our own vegetables. We probably won't be at the point of having our own meat by next year. We might have our own meat chickens, but we'll definitely be able to do our own veggies. And at least in a few months' time, we might have the 2 pumpkins that we've got in our backyard and the carrots that we've just planted at our property in the 1 garden bed that we do have. So we may be able to replicate this dish again in a couple of months' time with our own produce, which would be nice. But we would still have to buy our own chicken for that. So at this point, the potatoes are in the oven with the oven at about 200 to 220. So we obviously haven't put the pumpkin and the carrot in yet. And they're in that already preheated oil, so they're basically shallow frying. And I check on them every 10 to 15 minutes where I toss them and make sure that they're all evenly cooking. And I get them out of the oven before turning it down and putting the pumpkin and the carrots into the oven. Once the potatoes are out of the oven, I strain them and put them onto some kitchen paper, so paper towel, so that we can get that excess oil off, because they are obviously quite oily from being shallow fried. And then I usually will flip them out onto another bowl and then tap them dry with some more paper towel just to get all the rest of the excess off. And then I do like to add a bit of salt to make them a salty, almost potato chip, and they end up really, really crunchy and golden, which you'll see once the meal comes together and is all on the plate. It's definitely not the prettiest meal, but it is definitely one of the tastiest that we have in our family, and we do like to cook it quite a lot when the weather gets cooler, and it definitely makes for good use for leftovers, which is something that we really like to do in our family. But we try to use those leftovers to create a new meal the following day. So rather than just reheat it and have it as another roast chicken, we might put it into a pie, or in this case it turns into stock and risotto. So now we're popping up all those excess bits into a container to go down to our chickens. And my son was eating a capsicum that he didn't finish all of it, so that gets to go to the chickens as well. And an apple, which we do chop up, so we remove the bits the chickens can't eat. And here are those crunchy potatoes before we've pat them dry and got rid of all that excess oil. And here is the meal put together. It's definitely not pretty, but delicious. So this is the next day on Sunday, and I'm just taking out that roast chicken, what we didn't eat of it, and I've taken some of the meat off of that chicken and put it aside for one of the dishes that we're going to make later on today, which is the chicken noodle soup. Our family does really love the chicken noodle soup. We're a soup family when it comes to warmer, cooler weather as well. And we've just had quite a lot of cool weather here, but now it's gone back to being quite nice. So I do end up leaving a fair bit of the meat still on the chicken. I leave the legs on, I leave the wings on, but I take some of that breast meat out. You could take all of the meat off of the bone and use that for, we were making risotto, we were making chicken noodle soup, so you could use it for any of those 2 meals, or even just keep it shredded in your fridge for lunch meats. I decided to leave that on and have a bit more flavor in the chicken stock before I took it off the frame. Now, one thing that I will note, because I do note my mistakes as I make them, is as I started this, I hadn't really meal planned. I had a few ideas in mind of what I wanted to make, but I tend to cook without recipes. I tend to cook what I am feeling like cooking. I think up what I enjoy and what our family enjoys and kind of go with it. Usually we have the majority of the ingredients in our pantries for the things that we like to have on the regular. And so I started putting water into this pot and started thinking, okay, I'm going to make chicken noodle soup, I'm going to make risotto, and I'm going to make French onion soup because we had quite a lot of onions. Now, all three of those need chicken broth or chicken stock. So I'll just pour a lot of water and I'll just fill this whole pot and I'll make a lot of chicken broth. Now, if you're experienced in making chicken broth, you can see what problem would have arose, and that is that I didn't nearly have enough flavor in this stock. So by the time it had cooked down for a bit, because I had it on in the background the entire time I was making all the other meals, I tasted it and it just tasted like diluted chicken water and it just wasn't good enough. So I end up going down to the supermarket and buying a couple of roast chickens and taking all the meat off of the frames of those while they're hot, because it's always easier to remove the meat when it's hot, and putting both of those chicken carcasses into this water to try and get some more of that chicken flavor and let it cook for another couple of hours. Now, my mistake with that was I should have removed the skin, because the skin of the chickens from the supermarket is flavored, and so a lot of the flavor that you can taste in the chicken stock is that of the flavoring that was put on those chickens. And I also entirely forgot to take the stuffing out, which is okay because it is all extra flavor and it's all flavors we do like. It just wasn't the flavor I was going for. So next time when I make this and I pre-plan it properly, I'm going to get a couple of chickens and roast them in the oven, because it's always better flavor for chicken stock if it's roasted first. And then I'll take the meat off them for us to use in the other meals that we're having. Probably the same order as what we did this weekend, where the Saturday we did the roast and the Sunday we did the cook up, just so that it's not a really big mammoth task to roast all that meat and then go into a big day of making stock when the stock takes so long to cook down. So I add the carrots from the roast the night before and pop them in just for some added flavor, because they were just going to go to the chickens otherwise. And I end up getting some onions that we were going to use in the French onion soup, and I top them. So I take the root end and the tops off of all the onions that are going into the chicken noodle soup, the French onion soup, and put them into the stock. And then I find a big bunch of garlic that had been sitting on our bench since Easter that you can tell it's starting to sprout. So I cut that up and popped that into the chicken broth as well. And then grabbed some onions. After doing the onions, I then grabbed carrots and put some chopped up carrots into the water as well. Now, next time I will probably have a few more ingredients to do a bit more flavor in there, but if I had put 2 or 3 chickens that were roasted into that pot from the very beginning, it would have been a very flavorful stock. When I last made stock a couple of weeks ago for the Cheats chicken noodle soup, I had just the one roasted chicken frame, but I only covered it enough just to cover that chicken frame in a much smaller pot, so we had a lot more flavor, and I only cooked that for 40 minutes or something because I was trying to get it done quickly. So it definitely works. I just definitely over committed to the water this time and didn't really think it through. Now I go out to our front garden and we have a massive rosemary bush out the front, so I'm just grabbing some rosemary from our rosemary bush, and I got enough to be able to use for the risotto as well as chucking some into the stock pot too. So I bring those in and pop those into the stock pot. So it would have looked a lot better if it had a couple more chicken frames. Definitely a must for next time. After I put in the rosemary, I did go and put some thyme in there as well, but next time I'd probably grab some from our garden too. So another dish that our family eats pretty much every single week all year round that freezes really well and can be made in bulk is spaghetti sauce. So I'm chopping up the onions now that go into the base of making our spaghetti sauce. So we dice these up reasonably finely and then pop them into a pan with some olive oil and try to fry them off a little bit on a low heat, almost to start caramelizing them a little bit, and I add a little bit of salt to sweat them out just a little bit. We don't end up completely caramelizing them, but it is over a low heat for a fair amount of time just to soften them up while we chop up the other ingredients. So now they're all diced up. We pop them into the pan with the olive oil and continue to chop up the rest of the ingredients, which for us at this point we dice some bacon. We find that it has quite a nice flavor if we cook out the bacon with the onions, but I do like to sweat those onions out and soften them up a little bit and get them a little bit towards caramelizing before we add the bacon into the dish. So now I'm just going to chop up that bacon. Again, these are chopped up just into small, like 1 centimeter thick pieces. And this particular type of bacon was crumbling quite a lot. It isn't the usual type of bacon that we use, but it tasted completely fine anyway. It's going into a sauce, so it didn't really matter that it was crumbling. It almost made it a better texture for falling apart in the sauce. So it ends up being, I think, about 4 rashers of bacon and just chopped into 1 centimeter cubes. And then I add that to the frying pan with the onions and the garlic. So you can use minced garlic, you can use fresh garlic, you could use sliced garlic, however you prefer your garlic, you can put that into this dish at this point. We like to use our confit garlic. It just gives it a little bit more depth of flavor. So if you saw in our previous video about the cooking we did over the Easter weekend, we made some confit garlic, and that's just sitting in the oil in our fridge. So I end up, after we fry up these onions and bacon, I go to our fridge and after we also add the herbs, because I do like to grab the rosemary and thyme at this point and fry it out with the oil. I find that releases the flavor for these harder herbs. If it were something like basil, I tend to put that in fresh at the very end, But something like rosemary and thyme, where it's got a bit of a deeper flavor and it's nicer in slower cooked meals, I like to put that in the beginning when we're doing the frying stage to release the oils out of those herbs and cook it into the oil with the onions and the bacon. So at this point, at the very beginning of the recipe, while we're frying out the onions and the bacon, I just grab that rosemary that we picked from the bush in our front garden, and I pull it apart directly into the fry pan and just start to fry it off with those onions and the bacon, before then adding that comfy garlic from the fridge and the thyme as well. So that's just simmering over a low heat as well. We make sure to keep that on a low heat so that it does not burn too quickly. The whole meal is kind of very gradually, slowly cooked, and this spaghetti sauce tends to take about an hour from start to finish for it to get all that depth of flavor. So now I'm just adding the thyme. I sprinkle probably about half a tablespoon over the dish. I used probably 2 10-centimeter sprigs of rosemary in this as well. The onions, it was 2 diced onions and then about a tablespoon of olive oil. And then when I go grab out the comfy garlic, we use about, I think 6 or 7 cloves end up going in this, and they are whole cloves, but I do end up squashing them with the spoon so that they're more of a minced garlic consistency, but they have a really deep flavor to them because they were slow cooked comfy style. So I'm just smashing up that garlic with the back of the spoon and just mashing it into a minced garlic consistency. The other thing you could do is put that comfy garlic through a garlic crusher and it would have a similar effect. You just have to clean all the oil and garlic off that garlic crusher. So again, next time we cook this, or probably not next time, we would like to be able to use the majority of our own home produce. We haven't grown any of our own onions yet. That's something that we're wanting to do this year. We do obviously have the rosemary already established. We do have some thyme plants, but I just happen to use the dried thyme this instant because it was already just there and ready to go, and it was a slow cooked meal anyway, so I tend to find that they rehydrate and the flavor comes out really well anyway. The garlic, we did just plant about 160 cloves in a garden bed that we prepped at our property. I was a little bit concerned that because we don't live there and we couldn't really watch it, we hadn't actually been back to the property for 2 weeks, and I was a little bit concerned that it wasn't going to grow and that we were going to lose that entire crop. But we did just go visit over the weekend and had a look, and it actually, almost all of it was good to go. There was probably 2 cloves that had been dug up by birds and pecked at a little bit, even though we had a cover over it. But the majority of them have all come up, and so have the carrots that we planted in that same garden bed. So other than getting our own meat for the mince portion and the bacon portion of this dish, I would like to think that by the end of the year we would be able to recreate this dish with almost all our own ingredients that we have grown ourselves on our property. So we do obviously end up using tomatoes in this, as it is a spaghetti sauce, so we would like to grow our own tomatoes this year. We do have our own passata that we put up at Easter, which is also in our previous video, but as you'll learn in that video, we had some issues growing our tomatoes this year, so that actually was purchased tomatoes, but we did preserve them ourselves. Now this mince that's going in is a beef and pork combination. I tend to find that works really well in the spaghetti sauces. So again, in the future, the very distant future, we would like to get our own meat cow and our own meat pigs, and we would then be able to recreate this dish. It is a major goal of ours to be able to recreate this dish with the mince and the pork, the bacon, both the beef and the pork mince, that should be, as well as the onions, the herbs, the garlic, the tomatoes, all of that homegrown. Now, one ingredient that we do use in this spaghetti sauce is we do deglaze the pan with a red wine. And part of our vision for our property is to have a vineyard on the hill. You would have seen that in our tour of the farm video. And we will end up making our own, or growing our own grapes for both red and white cooking wines. Both myself and Ben aren't really big wine drinkers, but I do use a lot of red and white wine in cooking, and I do love the flavor profile of wine in cooking. So we are intending on trying to grow our own grapes to make our own white and red wines, but we'll see how that goes. I highly doubt it's going to be anything worth selling, but it hopefully will be worth putting into our own cooking, which would be nice, and it'll definitely look pretty on the hill. So at this point I have, I think, 2 of the meals going. I've got the spaghetti sauce started, and the stock, I suppose it's not a meal, it's part of multiple meals. I've got the chicken stock on. So now I've just realized, after finally putting all of this meat in and breaking it all up, that we actually had some more meat in the fridge. So I've just gotten that out and I'm about to add that into the pot. I decided that if we had more meat, then I could make a bit more of a bulk sauce, and it didn't need to be a real high meat content in a small amount of sauce. Instead, we could use more of our tomatoes and just fill up this whole pan with the spaghetti sauce, and then have just way more for us to be able to use. It's one of the things that I really like about cooking this spaghetti sauce. It's really full of flavor. It's quite delicious. Our family really likes pasta, so we don't really get sick of having it. It could also be used in lasagna. Part of making lasagna that I kind of put off is because of the time that takes to make up the sauce and then put all the layers together. But I could make up a huge batch of this spaghetti sauce and have that in our fridge or freezer ready to go to then make up a whole heap of lasagnas. And our family really loves lasagna, and that also freezes and defrosts really well. So now I'm about to deglaze the pan with the red wine. So we do add red wine into our spaghetti sauce. I personally love wine as a flavor in most cooking. A lot of our pasta sauces, even our white pasta sauces, have some kind of wine in them. I like risotto because it's got wine in it. In fact, I'm pretty sure most of the dishes I'm making this day have wine in it, because the French onion soup also has white wine. So that is something that we readily have on hand for our cooking, despite the fact that Ben and I don't really drink wine at all. So I think next time I make this dish, I'm going to do 2 or 3 pots worth and just do a huge spaghetti sauce cook up, because the amount that we make on this day, we've already eaten probably 3 meals worth, and it's not even been a week. And I like to freeze those up into either portions for 1 person, portions for 2 people, as opposed to a massive amount, as I can always defrost multiple portions, but it's harder to know if we will be able to use what is left over within 24 hours if we don't eat it all. And so next time I think I'm going to make a lot more of this in multiple pans, and maybe even try it in the slow cooker, because this does finish in the oven, so I would end up running out of oven space would be my only problem. But we do have a real deep Dutch oven that you did see us use earlier for, actually that's what the chicken stock is cooking in. So I could have put it all in the Dutch oven and then put that in the oven. It just would have taken probably a lot longer to cook down as opposed to if I had put it into multiple pans. So I probably will still go with the multiple pans option, because I know the timing for that, and I don't want to be spending all afternoon trying to cook down a spaghetti sauce when we can get the whole thing finished in an hour with a big deep flavor if we just have multiple cooking options. So maybe I'll also try out our slow cookers. We actually now have 2 slow cookers, as we spent the majority of probably 6 months thinking we didn't have one. We'd taken it to an event for a slow cooked lamb roast, and then we didn't see it again, apparently. That's what we thought. After 6 months, we finally bit the bullet and went and bought a new one, and the very next day we found the old one. It was in a cupboard we had not looked at, and apparently we had had it the entire 6 months. So now we have 2 slow cookers, but that's absolutely okay, because we can always slow cook meals that we can then freeze for later, so that'll come in very helpful. The next time I do a big cook up day, I'll then have the stove top, the oven, and 2 slow cookers to be able to do my cooking on, and could also then do some mix-ups that go into Ziploc bags in the freezer that can then be dump and go recipes, or can be take out, defrost over a day in the fridge, and then grill them up or fry them into some stir fries. So here is the cooked down meat mixture. I'm now adding the passata. So if you wanted to make a lot of sauce, you could have split this into 2 different portions and then added a lot more passata and a lot more canned tomatoes than what I use. Usually we would use our own homemade passata or our own diced tomatoes, but we haven't done any diced tomatoes this year because of our failed tomato crop this year. So when we did our bulk processing of tomatoes, we only did passata and then pizza pasta sauce. So we do have to buy some canned tomatoes unless we decide to do another bulk purchase of tomatoes to just do diced and whole canned tomatoes. We might end up doing that because I do a lot of pasta sauces, spaghetti sauces. We might do a lot of lasagnas this year. I might do some bulk butter chicken dishes, some other curries that have tomato in them. So I'm thinking it might be a good idea to do another bulk order of tomatoes while the weather is still somewhat okay. And then we'll have some diced tomatoes and whole tomatoes in the pantry as well. We do have a lot of passata because we did make that the other week, but I didn't want to use it straight away, and we did already have these cans in the cupboard. So now it's all mixed in. Here I've just ground up some sun-dried tomatoes, including the oil, and that just gives a bit more depth of flavor. Normally I use sun-dried tomato pesto, but I didn't have any sun-dried tomato pesto in the pantry at this time. So I did end up finding a whole can of sun-dried tomatoes in olive oil. So I blitzed them up and I'm adding those in now. So I filled that pan right up to the brim with the tomatoes so that we could get quite a lot of sauce. Now this is our pork shoulder. We couldn't find any pork butt at the supermarket, so we opted for pork shoulder, and that was going in overnight in beer to slow cook to then add a barbecue sauce for pulled pork. So while that's cooking in the slow cooker, I then turn my attention to starting the risotto. So I've diced some more onions, nearly said tomatoes, I'm stuck on tomatoes. I've diced some more onions, I've popped them in the pan with olive oil, and then I start to cook them on a very low heat. I think I used only one onion for this, but again, if I had a larger stove, we have some induction cooktops that we plug into the wall for our caravan. So next time I could use a couple of our induction stove tops as well to get more cooking done over the same amount of time. And then I could do either multiple batches of the risotto, or I could do a larger pan. However, again, even with the risotto, it's kind of the same as doing a large pan of that spaghetti sauce. It then takes a really long time to cook down, and then you've got less control over how it turns out. So I would probably look at getting our induction cooktop out of the caravan and plugging it in somewhere and just having the two side-by-side risottos, as I do find that the risotto freezes really, really well. We did just have it the other day, so at the end of this video I will pop a picture of what it ended up looking like after we'd taken it out of the freezer. We defrosted it in the microwave, and then I put some prosciutto in the oven. Once the prosciutto was basically done, I turned the oven off and put our pine nuts on the same tray with the prosciutto, closed the oven door and left that for a couple of minutes. And then when I came back, the pine nuts were nice and golden brown. And then we topped the risotto dish with the oven baked prosciutto and pine nuts, and it ends up tasting absolutely delicious and exactly the same as if it had come out of the pan at the time. The fresh little additives at the end is really what makes the dish. So we don't have any more prosciutto in the fridge, but we do have a lot of the risotto still in the freezer. So I would probably go and get some more of that prosciutto each time we plan to cook this dish for dinner. So now I'm just grabbing that last rosemary sprig that I had taken from the garden earlier when we did the stock. I think I have 2 sprigs actually of the rosemary. So I'm pulling that off and also trying to snap the pieces of rosemary into smaller pieces as I go. I could have pulled this all off onto a chopping board and chopped it all up with a knife, or I could have grabbed some kitchen scissors and trimmed it into the pan, but I decided to do it this way and that the flavour would probably be pretty much the same. Once we have all of the rosemary in there, another one of the flavours that we really like in our risotto, very similar to the pasta sauce, is fresh thyme. Now, in another video that's coming up, we did finally buy another fresh thyme plant that we have planted into our vertical planter, but we didn't have any on this day, so I had some dried thyme in our herbs and spices drawer, and I do end up taking that out and adding it to the dish at this stage. As I said when I was cooking the spaghetti sauce, I personally like to put those hearty sort of herbs in at this point when I'm frying the onions. So I tend to put in my rosemary and my thyme. If I had oregano, I'd probably put that in at this point as well. And then I fry those into the oil and into the onion. At this point is when I would also be adding any garlic or ginger if I had ginger going into a dish. This dish does not have ginger, so I would be adding the garlic in at this point to fry that in. Now, usually we would use minced garlic in this dish. You could get fresh garlic, chopped garlic, or mince some from fresh. I end up using our confit garlic from the other day when we processed our crop of garlic from this year's garden. But we are already almost out of the first jar. We only have 2 jars because we did not get that much garlic this year. So I think we might end up doing a bulk purchase of garlic as well and having a big garlic processing day where we mince some into teaspoon or tablespoon sizes and freeze, and also confit some more. I do find the confit flavour to be really, really nice. And one of our habits, I suppose, is to buy the large 1 kilo jars of minced garlic to be using in our cooking because we use a lot of garlic. So we would like to head towards growing our own. We did plant 160 bulbs of garlic or cloves of garlic at our property. So I'm hoping that's going to result in a larger garlic harvest. I'm considering planting even more because, as I said, we use a lot of garlic. So I just smashed that up with the back of my spoon because it is soft, but they were whole garlic cloves. So now I stir that into the dish with the herbs and the onions before adding in the arborio rice. This is risotto, so it does need arborio rice. I don't actually measure how much rice I put in, but I think it ends up being, I feel like it was a 1 kilo bag and I put about 500 grams in, but that doesn't really look like 500 grams, but maybe. I don't really measure it. So my thought process at this point is I wanted to bulk cook my risotto. I wanted to have as much as possible just from this pan. And I know that the rice will double in size. So I put as much rice as I could, but allowing for it to expand when we add the stock so that it wasn't too much for this pan. So now I'm just lightly toasting that arborio rice in with the garlic, the herbs, the onions, and the oil. And when I start to get a little bit of a browning color on the rice and on the bottom of the pan, then I deglaze the pan with white wine. Again, I don't really measure how much white wine I put in, but it was probably about 1 cup. And that then deglazes all of that brown color off the bottom of the pan and adds that flavor into the sauce that's going to start forming as we cook down the arborio rice. But I just poured enough in to kind of coat the bottom of the pan and then have about a 1 centimeter lip up the side of the pan. So it was enough to add the white wine flavor, but not to dominate the dish with a white wine flavor. So at this point, we are now about halfway through cooking our risotto dish. The spaghetti sauce is in the oven finishing off. The chicken stock is just about ready to use, but as I said earlier, I did make a mistake by just putting too much water and not enough chicken frames. And I do end up using that stock to make this risotto. And so I could have added more chicken flavor by just sprinkling some chicken stock powder over the top of this dish. But because it had so many other flavors in the dish, it did not really matter that much that you couldn't taste a lot of the chicken flavor. It just ended up being almost more of a vegetarian dish because I didn't put any of the shredded chicken in either. But we could have definitely put the shredded chicken in at this point. And I could have even cooked more bacon with the onions at the beginning of the spaghetti sauce and just taken some of those out to add some bacon and onion in at this point with some shredded chicken. The shredded chicken I wouldn't add in at this point. I would put it in further in the dish when it was nearly ready since the chicken was already cooked. And then we also have the pork shoulder going for the pulled pork. And we haven't started on our French onion soup yet. So now I am deglazing the pan. At this point, I've been cooking for probably almost an hour. And once that's kind of bubbled down a little bit, I then start gradually adding the chicken stock. And if you haven't cooked risotto before, what I tend to watch for is if you were to bring that wooden spoon down the center of the pan and separate your rice to be able to see the base of your pan down the center. If you were to get a whole pool of liquid to come down and cover the bottom of the pan, then you still have too much liquid and it hasn't cooked down enough. If you were to do the same thing and it was like a thick kind of almost glue looking, then you can add some more of your chicken stock, and you want to make sure that it is really low heat. It is bubbling a little bit there, so I possibly could have had it even lower, but our lowest burner on this stove doesn't work, so this is what I was dealing with. So we cook it down a little bit, mix it in regularly. The key with risotto is to make sure you are standing right there with it and that you are stirring it and checking it regularly so that it does not stick to the bottom of the pan, it doesn't go crispy, and that your rice is staying hydrated and expanding gradually. So I've come back to check. Now it's a little bit liquidy still when I'm stirring there, but it is starting to get to that nearly glue-like consistency. So I could almost add some more of the stock to the pan at this point, and then slowly cook down that next bit of stock. So I only add a little bit at a time as well. So I've only added 1 cup, and you can see that's made that quite a lot of liquid. It's looking like a bit of a pool, and it definitely needs time for that rice to absorb all that liquid before we would add any more. It ends up being, at a guess, I'd say 7 or 8 cups of liquid that end up in that risotto. So now I'm starting on the French onion soup. So I've got quite a lot of butter in there. I did not measure it. I decided to base the soup off of how much ingredients we had because I wanted as much as possible, and that was almost all of the butter in our fridge. I did have some left over to put in to finish the risotto. So it ended up being, at a guess, about 100 to 125 grams of butter. And then this was about 7 onions chopped up. You can chop them up smaller. It depends on how you feel about onions, but generally speaking, if you're eating French onion soup, you like onions. I personally like my French onion soup served with a toasted bread that has cheese melted on it as well. Or one way that I really like having my soups after visiting a friend in Europe many years ago was a bread bowl that was toasted, and you put the cheese in the bottom of the bread bowl, and then you pour the soup into the bread bowl on top of the cheese and have all the pieces that you'd removed from the bread bowl lightly toasted, and you just dip them in and eat the soup that way. Just checking on all of our dishes, seeing how they're all going. I do cover up the spaghetti sauce with foil until the very, very end, and I do check on it regularly. Now, I have skipped over a bit of the risotto as it is a slow process. I did choose to chop up some zucchinis that did come from our garden and pop them into the risotto. They've been cooking for about 5 or 10 minutes, and I've added probably another 5 cups of stock, but one at a time to cook them down. The rice has expanded quite a lot. It's now nearly filling the pan. And now I'm getting the Parmesan cheese and grating that in. I probably end up grating about 50 to 70 grams of Parmesan cheese. You could put a lot more. It's completely up to you. we only had that one block of Parmesan cheese and I wanted it for a few dishes, especially if we were having pasta during the week. And then we also add in the rest of the butter that we had in our fridge, which I think would have been about a 50 to 75 gram block of butter. And this is when the rice is entirely cooked through. So I do test that with a spoon just to check that it is cooked through. And then these are the finishing processes. So you still want the rice to be saucy. You don't want it to be completely just rice. You do want there to be a little bit of that liquid in there still. And then to add those finishing products, so the cheese and then the butter. And then we also had the roasted pumpkin from our roast chicken the night before, so that was in the fridge. So I am dicing that up at this point, and that then gets topped in there at this point so that it can heat up again. And then finish off salt and pepper, and just to taste to see what you prefer. I make it so that it's not too salty at this point because I am going to finish it off with the prosciutto, and the prosciutto has quite a high salt content, so you do want to watch if you are finishing it with a prosciutto. Otherwise you could add more salt at this point, especially if using your own homemade chicken stock, because it shouldn't have as much of a salt content as what you would buy from the supermarket. So other than finishing it with the pumpkin, sometimes we also would put in some chopped up tomatoes at this point, but this one's more of a winter vegetable risotto. So we've got the zucchini and the roasted pumpkin and some onions in there, but that's basically the only vegetable flavors. And again, I would put that shredded chicken in at this point, but we chose to make it a vegetarian risotto. So that's it basically finished at this point. Adding in some salt and pepper to taste, and just those last little finishing products. Black pepper, you could put white pepper if you don't want it to show up so much in the dish, being a lighter colored dish, but we have, I think, only got black pepper at home at the moment. Can't say I tried to look that hard. And if I wanted to, I could have roasted some garlic and made the garlic a standout flavor in this as well, and just had whole roasted garlic cloves in there. That would have been quite nice too. So we're cooking down our onions with the butter. This has to slow cook for about 40 to 45 minutes. And I did add a bit of salt as well, just to help it to sweat out some more of that flavor and soften up. But our risotto is now finished, so I've packaged that up. We got about 4 servings for 2 people, one for one person, and then a smaller one for having some meals for our 10-month-old son. Anything that we can cook that is softer that he can have, since he's only got 5 teeth, we like to cook those and put them in the freezer too, so that he can have some of what we have, since now he watches us and gets upset when he can't have any. So I've just deglazed this onion soup with the white wine. I added about 1 cup of wine to this as well, and just deglazed all that browning on the bottom of the pan. And then I start adding the stock. I don't do the same thing as we do with the risotto. I'm not doing it like 1 cup and then stirring it down. I am just adding it all in. Now, I will admit at this point, I did realize that the chicken flavor was lacking and that it would stand out predominantly in this dish. So I did end up getting some store-bought chicken stock out of the cupboard and pouring, I think, about 1.5 liters of chicken stock that was store-bought into this. And then I added about 2 or 3 cups of the homemade chicken stock into this as well, so that it did have some of our chicken stock, but it had that deep chicken flavor in there.
Okay.
Because I wasn't able to go and get those additional chicken frames at this point. And I've also added some thyme to finish off that French onion soup. Now, this is how the spaghetti sauce has come out of the oven. And this is all our dishes all served up. I did also make chicken noodle soup, but you did already see in the Cheats chicken noodle soup how we make that. And here's our finished risotto after we defrosted it.